Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Nick, and I'm one of the events hosts here at Powell's Books in Portland, Oregon. Before we begin, I wanted to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual and live events by visiting our website at powells.com. If you don't already do so, please follow us on our social media channels via Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube. Tonight, we are thrilled to welcome Julia Glass in conversation with Daniel Mason, talking about Julia's new book, Vigil Harbor. Julia Glass is the author of 6 previous books of fiction, including the best-selling 3 Junes, winner of the National Book Award, and I See You Everywhere, winner of the John Gardner Fiction Book Award. In her latest book, when 2 unexpected strangers with hidden motives arrive in an insular coastal village, they threaten the equilibrium of a community already confronting climate instability, political violence, and domestic upheavals. Vigil Harbor reveals Julia Glass in all her virtuosity, braiding multiple voices and dazzling strands of plot into a story where mortal longings and fears intersect with immortal mysteries of the deep as well as of the heart. Glass will be joined in conversation by Daniel Mason, author of the novels The Piano Tuner, The Winter Soldier, A Far Country, and the story collection, A Registry of My Passage Upon the Earth, which was the winner of the California Book Award and finalist for the 2021 Pulitzer Prize. This evening's event will include an audience Q&A, so please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question. As well as if someone else has typed a question you'd also like to know the answer to, please upvote that particular question by clicking the thumbs up button. Lastly, support Julia and Powell's by purchasing a copy of her book from us. A link to buy Vigil Harbor will be shared in the chat a couple times tonight, as well as links to Daniel's books as well. Julia and Daniel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks. Julia, it's a pleasure to see you, talk to you today, and quite an honor to interview you about your wonderful book. And thanks, Nick, for the lovely introduction. I would add, in addition to Julie's accolades, that I've known her for nearly 15 years and have found, of course, across that time that she's not only a wonderful writer, but a very generous reader and champion of other writers' works, particularly young beginning writers like myself, for which both I and others are very grateful. So it was quite a pleasure and honor to be sent your novel in galley form early on and read it. And I have to say that this is the nice hardcover, but the galley that I received was left out in the rain by a mailman who I think was afraid of our dog. It's really not a very fierce dog, but loud. And so I ended up reading this fantastic, sort of watery, stormy book about oceans and harbors and maybe mermaids in this very sort of wavy, dried, watery form, which was very appropriate for the subject matter. So and I loved it. I read it in 2 sittings, and I probably could have read it in 1, except I needed to go to sleep. And I just love the fluidity with which you move between characters' minds. And I found myself reading it. I mean, it's hard now not to read anything as also a writer, not just someone reading a book for pleasure. And I found that the book offered both. It offered both the joys of reading, but also a kind of instruction on how to do it. And I'll have some questions about that later on. In all of it, it's infused with this sort of wonderful sense of the uncanny, in that it's a place that's familiar but not familiar. We know it's a fictional town, but related to a real one. The people are those recognizable and yet entirely their own. And then it takes place in this future, I believe, maybe 12, 13 years in the future, right?
Yeah, 12 years.
Which is a future which is both sort of familiar and not so. And because it's so much of a book about the place, and I thought maybe we would start by introducing. I imagined that some people who are attending today have read the book, but not everybody. And so maybe you could sort of introduce us and kind of get us into this watery mood by
First of all, Daniel, I just want to tell you, I was so thrilled when you accepted an early copy of my book to endorse. I'm a huge fan of your fiction, you know, your stories, but your novel, Winter Soldier, just blew me away. It's like a modern Dr. Zhivago, and I recommend to all of you out there to pick that one up as well as all the others. So Vigil Harbor is, as its title indicates, very much a book about the power of a place on its inhabitants. So I'm just going to read the first two paragraphs of the book. The book is told from the point of view of 8 characters, but there's also an omniscient voice that occasionally sort of gives you an overview of the world of this place, Vigil Harbor. And I'm just going to, and that is how the book begins. Let's say it's true that geography is destiny, place entwined with person. Would living on a peninsula, promontory, headland, bluff, make you peninsular by nature? Not someone who sticks out, but someone who likes backing up to a body of water, who finds a cul-de-sac comforting, not cornering. You'd miss out on casual, unpredictable commerce with travelers merely passing through, because your town would be a place of beginnings and endings, of retreat or stasis. And after a while, you'd likely notice a sameness to your neighbors. You'd all be a bunch of proud peninsulites, privileged, but also myopic. That's how some outsiders see the people of Vigil Harbor, a town that thrusts itself into the Atlantic Ocean, all but completely enclosed by restless water, deflecting the longshore current like a crooked foot aimed straight toward the rising sun. On a map, the harbor itself resembles a long blue parcel held snug beneath a muscular arm against the Massachusetts coastline. At the big toe, 2 of the town's oldest roads rise toward a park with a view raised high by granite cliffs. The shoreline here is rugged with rock, nothing like the bygone aprons of silken sand that once turned neighboring towns into summer playgrounds. Much of that sand recently eroded by pummeling rains and swallowed by storms that no longer repay the ground they borrow.
It's lovely. We're there. It's the map. You give us the map, and then I love the transition at the end. How all of a sudden you move us into this territory where we know that this is not only a physical place, but a physical place that exists in a state of menace, which will then pervade the entire work. The introduction goes on to present a parade, and then present the town song. And I was debating when I was going to ask you to sing the town song. I know it's not set to music, but the tone of it, I think, captures very much the tone of the book in certain ways. Why don't you, if you don't mind reading it, so just skip ahead a little bit. Yeah.
I'm also just going to say a couple of things to sort of set the stage too. So first of all, Vigil Harbor is based topographically, at least, and historically, on the town where I live in Massachusetts, which some people may know, and it's called Marblehead. And it is indeed a peninsula that juts out into the Atlantic Ocean, sort of midway between Boston and the more famous Cape Ann, which is a big tourist destination. And Marblehead began in the 17th century as a very rugged, libertarian cod fishing community and grew to be the largest cod fishing port in the colonies before the Revolution. And then it became a hotbed of patriot insurgency, very important in the Revolution. The Marblehead cod fishermen literally became George Washington's navy and saved his butt, by the way, several times, including rowing the regulars or the Minutemen across the Delaware River. So the patriotism in this town is just out of control. And the 4th of July is like a week long. And that's sort of the scene that's set in the first 4 pages here. So this is the first verse of the town song, which anybody who wants to write a melody, I would be happy to hear one, but these are the words. Take to your boats, O men, take to the sea. Hoist anchor, loft sail, like your fathers for ye. Leave behind hearth, oh, leave behind brides. We are sworn to the ocean, our fate in her tides. This be our fortune, the bounty down under. Leave whales to New Bedford, 'tis cod we shall plunder. Women and babes, let thy vigilance burn until to the harbor your mariners return. Corny, but that's, in the spirit of most town songs.
But great. I mean, you established in some way the humor of the song by mentioning this is the first verse only, in the way that we all really know the first verse of most of the songs that we sang, right? But I think that it also sets a kind of deep history to the book, which even though it's in the future, one of the, I don't say challenges or virtues maybe of writing about this area of New England, the fact, at least as far as America goes, areas, much of the rest of the world would probably laugh at me for saying this, but the history runs very, very deep, or continuous history runs very, very deep. And so even though the story is very much takes place in a sort of now or future now, this sense of groundedness, I think, is something that very much pervades the novel. And I also love the section because one thing I think that will come out in our conversation is that the book is very funny, and you treat your characters with a kind of gentleness, but you're also a kind of, I think, skepticism. I mean, they're humans, and you don't mind noting their foibles in a similar sort of way. I think the town song carries that sort of humor.
Well, you're the first person to ask me to read it, so thank you, Daniel.
Oh, it's the best. Well, when I saw it, I was pretty certain that you wrote it, but it was also possible you mined it from somewhere. I also think there's sort of a Melvillian start to the narrative here, and so the whole idea of a found text is kind of has that wonderful resonance. So I'm going to jump actually to the very end of the book, which is your author's note, and in it you're quite forthcoming about the sinuous path that this book took. And funny, by the way you write it, you said the book has been on and off my desk for nearly 10 years, as if you didn't write anything in the meantime. I think you've written 3 or 4 books in the meantime, but one, that's it? Okay.
One in the middle.
One in the middle. Okay. So I've started and restarted, abandoned, accursed, cajoled, overhauled, even set aside to write another. And I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about the novel's genesis, how you imagined it from the start, and how it became the book that it is right now.
Well, it's quite a story from my point of view, because I like to describe myself as a serial monogamist when it comes to writing novels. And unlike you, I'm not versatile enough to write. Very rarely I might write a short story, but I'm really, really a novelist. That's the gauge I work in. And when I work on a novel, there are no side novels. There's no, maybe an essay, maybe, but this is my focus. And I am with that novel until publication do us part. I've gotten used to the feeling at the very end that this is the last book I'm ever going to write, because it takes, it's not till I really release it to the pipeline at the publisher that I begin to think of the next book. And each book tends to come to me in the form of a character in a situation. So I had finished my 5th book, and was beginning to think about a character who was an architect who builds houses in a coastal town designed to withstand very severe weather. But in his past, so he's very successful in his 50s in this town that I imagined much like Marblehead, though I didn't know I'd become so literal minded about it. And but in his past, he'd had a relationship as a young man living in New York when he was starting out with a very intense, passionate, seductive, artistic woman who presented herself as otherworldly, as coming from the deep, be it a mermaid, a selkie, nothing so specific, but and he was so utterly taken with her that at first this seemed sort of fine, and he folded it into the relationship, but the relationship ended badly. And when you meet him in the story 12 years in the future from now. It's something that no one around him knows about. It's a secret he's ashamed of, feels guilty about, but he's remarried happily to a woman who has a 21-year-old son. And one of the things that happens in this book is that a woman from New York who was also in love with this passionate, intense, perhaps otherworldly woman whose name is Isa. This other woman comes to Vigil Harbor in search of answers about Isa. And she's one of two strangers who show up in town. You know, the classic stranger comes to town and everything is disrupted. But here's what happened. I don't believe in writer's block, but I just began to procrastinate like crazy. And I also thought, who am I to start writing magical realism? I mean, I'm about as foursquare realist as they come. And I thought, did a heavy object fall on my head or something? I mean, how am I doing this? And so I found myself doing things like I spent 3 hours on YouTube. This is not funny really, but when there were the Charlie Hebdo shootings in Paris, so I think that was January of 2014 or something, I watched the manhunt in Paris for 3 hours on YouTube instead of working on this book. And I thought, something is really wrong here. And at the same time, something even more disturbing happened, which is that I began to have an affair with some other characters. So suddenly I began to think about a trio of characters: a famous children's book writer's assistant, a British movie star, and a museum curator involved in a complicated situation. And I'm not kidding you, I don't do that. I do not think about the next character. So I'd say, well, okay, while I'm in the shower, I'm allowed to think about these characters, but then I'm going back to the architect and the otherworldly woman and get out of the shower, have my coffee. And I'd go to the computer, and I had created this tiny little file in the corner of the desktop, but I'd say, no, you can't go there. Or, okay, you can go there for 10 minutes. And then 45 minutes later. So I was really, it was so strange because I felt so guilty and I felt like it was such a betrayal. But, long story short, I just threw myself into the affair and I wrote that book. And that's my last novel, A House Among the Trees. And I wrote it more quickly. I don't want to say more easily, but more quickly than any other book. And then that book was published in 2017. And I had to decide whether I was going to, sheepishly make my way back to this book I had abandoned and betrayed. And I'm pretty stubborn about things. And I've never put a book in a drawer. And I don't think there are any that I've written that I've had to put in, that I ought to have put in a drawer. Because I just, I will myself through whatever the difficulties are. So now I'll tell you what steered the course of this novel when I returned to it. So when I had left it, it was basically 2014. And I had written over the previous year and a half or so, I'd written about 150 pages of this book. So 2017, and I looked up this date. So I know that it's June 1st. I was driving into our local garden center to buy a tree for my little yard. And Daniel, I'll never forget when I planted a tree once, you said, oh, plant a fruit tree. That was a previous tree that I planted. I thought that was very charming. So I was going to go find a tree, and I probably thought about you too, telling me, buy a fruit tree. So, but what? I have a fruit tree, but no, and I have to say one fruit tree I planted died on me. But anyway, we won't talk about trees. I love trees, but so I was listening to NPR as I drove, and our president, a different president than when I had been working on this book before, was going to make an announcement, and everybody knew what the announcement was going to be, except I thought it's not going to be that announcement. And I parked the car in the parking lot, and I listened until he came on, and he did indeed withdraw us from the Paris Climate Accord. And I sat in my car and I cried. I thought, do these people have children? What do they think is going to happen? And so, like a lot of people, I was thinking very hard about how unbelievable it seemed that people could just ignore climate science, just ignore all the warnings we were being given. And as it turned out, 2017 was also a year of very extreme weather. And again, I Googled this, but there were 17 named storms that year, 10 of which were hurricanes, 3 of which were Harvey, Irma, and Maria. And, you know, if you remember, those storms devastated the Gulf Coast and Puerto Rico, which to my knowledge, is not anywhere near recovered from that cataclysm. So that year, I'm all this weather, and I'm thinking, what if all these climate scientists and activists, you know, trying to get people to listen and act on what we know, I would hope everybody listening here knows to be a very urgent challenge that we all face. What if they decided that the only way to be heard would be to resort to violence, to a form of eco-terrorism? So in this world of Vigil Harbor, which is not a dystopia, you know, a dystopia is above my pay grade. I just, you know, this is not a world bombed back into the Stone Age. It's not, you know, it's a world that very much resembles ours, but the volume has been turned up on a lot of things that keep us up at night. You know, political divisiveness, immigration policies are stricter, but perhaps most notably, acts of terrorism, not on the scale of 9/11, but acts of terrorism in the name of causes like trying to preserve what's left of the rainforests are more common. So a town like Vigil Harbor, which is affluent, mostly white, but liberal-minded, are very aware of these forces in the outer world, but also feel somewhat sheltered, however false that sense of security is. And so what happens in this novel over the course of just a few days is that sense of safety and protection from the forces, the political forces of the outer world is punctured very dramatically.
Yeah, the title carries the double meaning very nicely. You know, both a kind of sanctuary, but one in which one must be vigilant against the world, which is increasingly getting closer. It's amazing. It's interesting that Austin is the first character that you.
Yes, and because he's really not that important anymore, is he? So,
well,
Austin is an architect.
But important, and I think that it represents like a kind of person, a sort of, optimism is a less cynical, optimistic is a less cynical word maybe that I'd like to use, but you know, a person who's in some ways profiteering from, although that might be a little bit too cruel, from the climate. You know, he's a person whose business is the hardening of houses against this future.
Well, you may not remember this term, and I heard this term when I was very late in writing a draft of this book. Apocalyptimist, is that it? Apocalyptimist. It's someone who sees the world heading toward a bad place, but is optimistic that there are ways to avert the apocalypse. So I
had not heard the word.
It's hard to say. I don't think I said it before. Apocalyptimist.
Yeah.
Probably a good sobriety test.
No, right. I hadn't heard. I don't know if I'm better for having heard it or not, though. Maybe I won't use it. Optimism would be nice. But so he's doing things, but then these other characters all come in, and you mentioned there's 8, and did they all? So when did they join the party? Is it like they kind of like you open the door and they came rushing into the room, or you decide I need this person to speak? And how many characters were left out? Like, are there voices you decide to cut entirely from the book? I'm curious.
You know, that's a good question. I can't at this point remember, but I will say, so I have faith when I start with my sort of signature character for a book, that other characters are going to emerge, if only, you know, to begin with, who are their parents, who are their children, who are their siblings, who are their coworkers. I'm really, really interested in all my books about the relationship between my characters and what they do, what their passions and their vocations are, their jobs, you know, what does that person do all day? And because of it, how has it helped determine who they are? So I knew I wanted to write about an architect, but in fact, I found out riding around town with an architect who showed me houses and things that I wasn't quite as interested in the minutia as I thought I was, but at the same time, perhaps another very important character who came in quite early is the character of Celestino. And he's a Guatemalan immigrant. I mean, he immigrated to the United States many years before. He's married to a woman who grew up in Vigil Harbor, a white woman. He has a successful landscaping and arborist business. And so he works with the architect. And he actually was a very important character in my fourth book, The Widower's Tale, which ends in this imaginary town of Vigil Harbor. So I felt him sort of knocking at the door. And that's how I decided to use Vigil Harbor. So I had the architect, I had the arborist, and then I knew that Austin was remarried, and his stepson Brecht is a character who initially was not supposed to be all that important. He is the first, after this introduction, he's the first voice you hear, and he's in a way the last voice you hear in the book too, which shocked me. But his situation is that he has come home to Vigil Harbor from college after narrowly surviving a terrorist act on Union Square in New York City. And so he's shell-shocked, and he works for Celestino and is trying to put his life back together. Is he going to go back to school? What's he going to do? And he sort of represents the person who in Vigil Harbor has been the most directly affected by these more violent forces in the world at large. And so, as happens when I'm creating a cast of characters, because I leave it very loose, it's always it's fun to discover which characters become more important than I initially thought they would, who upstage others. So it was really quite a surprise to me halfway through when I realized that Brecht would be much more than Austin's stepson, that he would be, in fact, a pivotal character in this book. And then I also wanted to have fun writing about the this sort of yacht club society of Vigil Harbor. And there's a little bit of satire in here of that kind of world. I mean, I'm around it all the time here, and sometimes I can't believe I really live in this town where, I mean, I don't have a yacht or a boat of any kind. I mean, I'd probably sink a rowboat or a canoe, but I'm happy to be invited to be ballast on somebody's boat. And it is a very boating oriented town. So, and sailing is quite an art. I mean, I've grown to admire the art of sailing here in town. So two of the important characters right from the start are Margot Tattersall and Mike Iliescu. And what happens at the outset of the book, among other things, is that their spouses, they are members of the yacht club, their spouses announce after a yacht club gala that they are running away together to a survivalist colony in the Midwest, and leaving Mike and Margot humiliated, shocked. They had no idea their spouses had been involved in an affair. And Mike is a marine biologist who's already got quite a weight on his shoulders. As a friend of mine said when I told her that one of my characters I said he was a depressed marine biologist. She said, what marine biologist would not be depressed? Which is sort of a sad thought. But Margot, on the other hand, is this spitfire of a character who is a retired, they're both in their 50s. She's a retired English teacher from the local high school. And she was, as I describe her, the teacher that every parent prays their child will have and every child dreads having, because students recite, Shakespeare's soliloquies, memorize, she's very strict. But she's quite a character. And as she puts it herself in one of the sections that she narrates, if you spend 5 days a week from 8 to 3 having your mouth policed, you come home and you swear like a sailor. So she is, she's very no nonsense and very forthright. And she was a great deal of fun to write. And then Petra is the woman who comes to Vigil Harbor in search of answers about Isa, the woman from Austin's past. And then there's another stranger who comes to town who is like Celestino, is a Guatemalan immigrant who has connections to Celestino's past that emerge only sort of gradually as the book goes along. That's one of the mysteries in the book.
Wonderful. And you mentioned Margot, you mentioned Mike, and we were talking about other sections that might be nice to read from. It actually feels like a perfect segue for a chance. And I love that you mentioned that she was fun to write, because you really get a sense that she's fun to write.
There's a lot of riffing on what the teaching of literature has become 12 years from now. There are familiar names and so forth, but she has a lot of opinions about the way.
So would you read for us that section?
So this is, both Mike and Margot are important perspectives in the novel. This is the first section where you meet Mike. It's about a week after his wife has left him, and all he's doing is moping around their beautiful historic home till somebody shows up at the door. So this is Mike. I drank too much, bourbon my poison of choice, and ate very little. One night I emptied a jar of almonds, almost literally pouring them down my gullet as I thought with grim, illogical glee of how much that jar had cost, trying to recall precisely when almonds had become a gastronomic luxury comparable to caviar. Caviar, now all but unobtainable, no matter how much money you cared to spend. So many curiously random foods, a thing of the past. Passion fruit, vanilla beans, certain kinds of tea, never mind codfish. I tried not to imagine Deanne, that's his wife. I tried not to imagine Deanne and that absurdly giraffish man fucking in the tiger maple four-poster bed she had bought on our honeymoon in Nantucket. Failing to shut out those images, I took to sleeping down the hall in the twin bed once occupied by my son, Egon. Every night when I turned out the lamp, I found myself drunkenly astonished that those plastic stars and planets I had affixed to the ceiling still, decades later, glowed so resolutely in the dark. I awoke every morning to behold, through my jackhammer headache, a time-warped poster of some ambisexual movie star playing Macbeth, reminder of yet further anxiety. A child well past childhood who wants to be an actor, or is an actor when he can be. Worse, a child living in New York City. I knew it was unsustainable, my gloomy retreat, and I knew I would have to move, sell the house. I would have to ask Egon and Marinda to come home one final time and sort through their childhood relics. I would also have to start answering my phone, or at least looking to see exactly whom I was ignoring. Egon and Marinda were the callers I dreaded the most, and I wondered if, had they lived closer, one or both of them would have materialized at the door on a mission of mercy. As if my wondering had summoned it, on day 8 of my self-exile, the second Sunday, the front door knocker sounded, vigorously, leading me to assume it was a man, though it was too vigorous to signal the arrival of my gentle son. Deluded has become my middle name. Please tell me you are taking that whore for everything she's fucking worth. Standing on my granite stoop was Margot Tattersall, whom I had last seen at the yacht club dinner, the final hours of my evidently willful ignorance, possibly hers as well, our last conjugal supper. When I failed to answer her challenge, she asked if she could come in. Could I say no? Why didn't I want to say no? Casting an eye over the teetering stacks of cereal bowls and highball glasses, she said, another woman would sigh with compassion and put this place back in order. She stared at me fiercely. But then she did sigh with compassion and her tone softened. I know it's noon, but I know we need a drink. And I see from the contents of the sink that you have not been shirking in that department. Let me guess, a diet of cornflakes washed down with Manhattans. She lifted a glass from the sink and sniffed it. Am I a genius or what? She said. And from a canvas shoulder She ordered me to find or clean 2 glasses. As I obeyed, Margot said, "So what did you do to drive the spouse away?" "Are you blaming this on me?" The first words out of my mouth since her arrival. "Of course not. But the general assumption around town was that you and that whore led a peaceful coexistence, probably spiced up with torrid sex. The absent-minded science guy being the male version of the smoking hot librarian. I mean, you were just about the only couple who never fell into a boozy squabble at one of the club dinners." "Oh, they're so simpatico. And he's so smart," she drawled. "I don't know who would say that," I said. "Most people there found me a crashing bore." Hearing myself assess my reputation at the club in the past tense, I realized that I would resign. This felt like a glimmer of good news. I loved the sailing, but I hadn't raced in years. "Who knew," I asked, "about them?" "Not me," said Margot. "I'd have had your wife's head on a platter, Salome style. If others knew, I will find out, and I will decapitate them promptly, impale their heads on the tallest masts in the harbor." This did not sound like a woman with a broken heart. A wounded ego, sure. Yet Margot was one of the club wives I had always vaguely enjoyed. She never hid her opinions. She was an accomplished solo sailor. And it was hard not to notice what a sexy dancer she was at the banquets. A little overweight by social standards, she wore dresses that told the world she liked her shapely shape. "Do your children know?" I asked. I told Tom I'd slit his throat if he didn't let me break the news. I do wonder if Cynthia knew already. Her outrage sounded a little synthetic. She's his favorite, but I forgive her. She asked about Egon and Miranda. When I admitted I hadn't spoken with them yet, she took a slug of her bourbon and actually whistled. "Because?" "I've been answering calls selectively." "Oh, Mike. Jesus, Mike. You're a good man. But you are kind of a coward, aren't you?" Perhaps my not feeling offended by Margot's remark only proved her right. "In answer to your first question," I said, "she's left me with practically everything." Ouch. Now that's emasculating, isn't it? Almost stunning, the sound of my own laughter. "So let's get you out of this house," she said. She picked up a pepper mill shaped like a Balinese dancer, away from all her tacky bourgeois shit. That is step 1 of your rehabilitation. "Who asked you to rehabilitate me?" I said. "I need a new hobby. I've chosen you."
That's great. Thank you. This, the unlikely but also likely couple.
Well, they form a kind of alliance of necessity.
Right.
It is not, it's platonic, but Margot is determined to, she has her own motives, but she's determined to make a project of Mike.
Right. Who was very ready for a project, whether he knows it or not.
Right.
So
Go ahead, Daniel.
Well, I was going to say that, so one of my jobs tonight is timekeeper, and unbelievably, it's 8:40, which means that we're going to open it up for Q&A. So so if you have any questions, please post them into the Q&A. In the meantime, we can continue talking though, and I'll monitor this as they show up. But I'll read from.
Yeah, we were talking a little before this about writing from many characters' point of view, and one of the things, sometimes people ask me if I have a favorite character, because I always write from several points of view. Right. And my feelings toward my characters shift and fluctuate as I go along. But and it sounds corny to say I care about them all, but I will say this: I became really concerned about Mike, and I mean in a kind of protective way, because I thought, how do I want this character to have a hopeful ending? But he's someone whose work, although he does make some progress, his work is on trying to save the salt marshes of the North Shore of Massachusetts. And his wife has humiliated him. And how do I kind of sail him toward a port where he, has a believable but hopeful ending. And that was a real challenge for me. And I just want to say that I feel like I hope I achieved it. The end to both, I mean, it's not an end because these characters, they go on in the future, but both Mike and Brecht, the shell-shocked young man, occupied a great deal of my most maternal attention. Because you can't just hand your characters a happy ending like a big box with a bow if you're writing, the way I write. But I wanted to think them forward into, especially in this very, perilous world, where are they headed at the end of the book? And they in particular were very, very important to me to point them in a direction I wanted them pointed in.
Is that a typical attitude that you have towards your characters, a maternal one, or are there others?
Well, I'd say there are always characters toward whom I do have a maternal feeling. And then there are ones that I start out quite infatuated with. They end up annoying me in some way. Do you know how it is when you meet people and you know what, I don't know, Daniel, you seem like a very unjudgmental person to me, but I'm kind of, I meet people and I form my opinions faster than I should. And I know I do. But what's so interesting is when you get to know someone over time and either that person proves to disappoint your early assumptions and expectations, or that person really grows on acquaintance. I mean, have you ever met someone who you thought I'd never be friends with that person, and then somehow as you get to know them, you see deeper into the sort of warrens of their psyche, and that I can't engineer that. It's I spent 2 to 3 years with all of my characters, and sometimes I come out the other end really, surprised at who I feel the most loyal to.
Sure. There's a reversal actually in the way the character develops in the book, which is lovely. It sounds like that occurs in your own mind. There's a question I want to answer, but I do want to just ask, as you're talking about this, it sounds like you let the book develop on its own. So you don't outline? Is that that's great. Has it always been the case, or?
Go ahead.
No, and yes, I'm wondering why. I'm curious. This is like a very much sort of between writers question, but I used to be very much in that outlining camp, and then lately I've moved, I think, a little bit away from that, and I found it's been sort of delightful and spontaneous in a way that I hadn't expected. Like it's put a little bit more fun back in writing. Not that it's always a mix of fun and anguish, but
I have to ask you too, and I hope I'm not people who've read profiles of you know that you're a psychiatrist also, right? And I've often wondered what, over the course of your writing, you have studied, the human mind and psychiatry, and a question I'd want to ask you if I were interviewing you is how that has affected the way in which you create character and story. I mean, do you think that has something to do with the way you've changed in your relationship to plot?
I think it comes in like other things. But and the topic of spontaneity, I think that there's a danger of psychiatry when working with spontaneity, because essentially, if there's anything that like purports or tries to be as scientific as possible, it's to sort of remove the spontaneous and to be able to explain somebody. And in fiction, you don't want somebody explained. Right. It's lovely to hear. Now we're getting a lot of questions. So out of interest in time, let me attend to some of these. So did you find yourself thinking about characters or situations from your previous books when writing this one? That's an interesting question.
Is because Celestino is such an important character in The Widower's Tale, continuity is an issue. I would not call any of my books sequels to others, and yet characters do sometimes return, and often somewhat unexpectedly. And my joke about those characters is that it's like the guest who left their hat at your house after a dinner party, and they come back to get the hat, and they end up staying for a week. Like, you just get the hat, can you, like, but no. So so I thought a lot about Celestino's story. And when you read this novel, if you read, you don't have to have read The Widower's Tale, but if you did, you will recognize things, lines of plot, or you might think about the Celestino that you knew in The Widower's Tale. So that was one book I had to think about, certainly. But this book was also different because of my decision to write into the future. I mean, if it's speculative, I call it baby steps speculative, but here's the thing, and it's kind of a paradox that I ran up against. The nearer the future you write about, the narrower your margin of error. So,
right.
COVID happened when I was almost done with, or thought I was almost done with the book. And I had to go back into it because COVID is too close in the rearview mirror. I mean, right. I think coping with COVID in various ways, I hope increasingly benign ways. But anyway, so yeah.
It's fascinating. So, I mean, did you contradict the earlier book in any way? Does this depart from that Celestino? I mean, you say it's not a sequel, but you're speaking of it as if there's nothing that doesn't sort of fit with that earlier work. And then the follow-up question would be,
very much. I mean, the continuity of it is important, but Celestino was very much I don't want to call him a loner in the previous book, but he was alone. Mm-hmm. He yearned he was in love with a woman who didn't reciprocate his love, but now when you meet him here, he's married with an 8-year-old son. And I had to, some decades had gone by in between, and I had to really think about the arc of those decades.
But that's lovely to imagine. You're speaking of it as if there is like one greater overarching novel from which these two novels are drawn. Because you also could have said, no, they're two different books. I mean, they have the same name, they're slightly different, but I'm going to change them entirely. But I love the idea that they're actually drawing from the that there's a truth out there, and you're pulling these characters from that fabric.
I made a living for years as a copy editor and proofreader, and you can't. I mean, I'd lose sleep if he didn't have the same color eyes and didn't. I mean, I have to. So the weird thing is, I don't reread my books, but I had to go back and read parts of Widower's Tale. So, and that always feels a little odd too. But at least I thought, oh my God, you worry that you're going to be ashamed of a book earlier. But I actually was like, wow, I wrote this, because I also read scenes that I have no memory of writing.
Yeah. No, that happened to me. A friend asked me about something I didn't remember writing recently. So, so another question, a bunch more questions have come up here. Speaking of characters one loves, will we see Walter and Fenno again?
Oh, okay. Thank you for asking that. And thank you for including Walter in that, because Fenno is who is, the protagonist of 3 Junes, my first novel, and comes back in The Whole World Over, and then a couple novels later in The Dark Sacred Night. And he picks up Walter on the way. I love those characters. And, I won't say they won't come back. I'm not there yet. And I have a different idea that I literally on the plane, I went out west for some touring. I just wrote the first 3 paragraphs of what I believe is going to be my next novel on the plane. So here I am. And and I don't think that any of my previous characters are coming back, but I don't know. But I'm not finished with Fenno and Walter. I'm not.
One of the attendees wrote in response to that, bring on the Julia Glass cinematic universe. Like Marvel, you could have like a whole franchise. Someone asked whether you're working on another novel. So you gave us the answer to that question. It sounds like you've started a new one. You've also told us that you don't write short fiction earlier on. So it must be.
I did contribute a short story to an anthology that came out recently called Anonymous Sex. So.
Yes, I heard about that. Do you want to tell folks about that book? Because it's
Sure. It came out in February, and it's what it is it's a collection of, I think it's 27 short stories, and they're all why don't I say they're about sex? There's a lot of sex in these stories. Some are, skew, but they're literary stories, at least ostensibly. And they're by prize-winning authors. Thea O'Brett is in it. And I'm going to blank on who's, but a lot of, esteemed writers agreed to be in it. But the conceit is this. You open the book and there's a list of the stories and the pages they're on. And there's a list of authors, but you don't know which author wrote which story. And we're all under contract we cannot tell anyone, I haven't even told my husband, you can't tell anyone which story you wrote for 18 months after publication. And moreover, you can't tell anybody which stories you didn't write. So of course you get friends calling you up and going, I know it's this one, one. And I'm shocked at the stories that but what happened also is this, the bound galley, the advanced reader copy was on our kitchen table last summer, and my 25-year-old son was here with his girlfriend, and they went, ooh, and they picked it up, and they had a system. Within about 45 minutes, they guessed which story was mine. Yeah, there was a tell for my son on the first page of the story. So he got it, but I turned bright red, but I wouldn't confess. So my son guessed, and that was
one person in the world other than you, who knows? Now you have to put him under contract. So. Another question about characters, not surprisingly. Do your characters come from the kinds of people you've met, or do you just create them from scratch? Also, I love the Zuri dress you're wearing. Am I right?
It's a Zuri shirt. Yes, it is. I love Zuri. I own way too many Zuri items. It's kind of an addiction. So go Zuri. They actually, by the way, if you're a Zuri fanatic, they just this week released a dress that has flying books on it. The color of the dress is sort of insane. It's like the color of a school bus with these magenta books flying all over it, but I had to have it. So, but characters, I'd be a liar if I didn't say that real people inspire my characters. But by the time I have fully developed a character, that I've really explored that character 360 degrees, miles down deep into their psyche, they become something, they depart from whatever that initial inspiration was. The one exception is Fenno's mother in 3 Junes is so much my own mother. And when my mother read the book, she called me up, and I thought, well, it's kind of her. But she called up, and the first thing she said was, that character Maureen, she said, is that me? I said, well, kind of. And she said, I just love her. So that was a relief.
That's good.
Maureen, so.
I imagine that's one of the perils of living in a small town and writing about a small town. Did you ever feel worried that folks would read Vigil Harbor and start wondering what?
Oh, it's already started. And I say to everybody, the people are my people in a town like Marblehead. They're not, but my best friend here who got an early copy was reading it, and she came and she said, oh, actually, I better not use their real names, but she said, oh, the McGillicuddies or something like that. I said, what? And she said, the couple that leave their spouses and run off together, isn't that the McGillicuddies? And I'm like, who are they? But something like that is bound to happen in any town. So, I haven't had any rocks thrown through my window yet, and I don't know. And this is not the town I grew up in, by the way. So my mother still lives in the town I grew up in. And I will say this, when my first few books came out, and I would go to my childhood bookstore, which is, next to my parents, and my parents' friends are the kind of people who have book groups, so they do read. And suddenly I had this sort of spasm of pity for my parents, because I thought, if their friends read these books and assume that I am basing, like, it's like, Maureen,
that you didn't.
Maureen has an affair in 3 Junes, and her husband isn't based on my father, but my father did say to me at one point, still trying to figure out who your mother had that affair with. I'm like, just off the, like, say, no, Dad, I made that up. So you never know who's going to assume things about your family based on reading your books. Your family knows what's true and what's not, but other people may assume a great deal.
Right. Even if it's not deliberate. So,
Right.
I mean, in a way, you might as well just steal things from people's real lives, because if you're going to get accused of it anyway, like, why not?
Yeah, and by the way, I've accidentally stolen things from people that I didn't realize I was stealing, and fortunately not with ill consequence. But so.
Do your name? Where do you get your names from of your characters?
Oh, all kinds of places. Some just kind of come to me, but here's something that I always point out to my students that I teach in the MFA program at Emerson College. A person's name, unless they change their name, that name tells you more about their parents than it does about them. Your parents chose Daniel. My parents chose Julia. So if your name were Blue Sky, for instance, what would I conclude? I mean, Daniel is a very forthright traditional name. So I might think it doesn't mean your parents are straight ahead traditional, but they didn't name you Sequoia, or if I had been named, or if you had been named, let's see, Alden Smith the seventh or something, then we would know that bloodlines matter a great deal to them. So I always think, I might love a name for a character, but it has to ring true to the parents who gave it to them. And it's something you can think about. So, but names are fabulous. I mean, I wonder if all writers were as tormented about choosing their children's names as I was. It just, it had to be perfect. It had to be the exact perfect name. And one of my friends who already was a mother said to me, you know what, after a little while, it's just another word in your vocabulary that you utter sometimes with great love and at other times not so much as the child grows older. So, but it's very important to me. So.
I think we have time for one more question, unless someone wants to throw in maybe two more questions. But here's a question about translating your books for film or television. Has anyone ever tried to do that?
No, I've never had any of my books optioned. I came very close with my last one, House Among the Trees. I had a wonderful conversation, a long conversation with two screenwriters who I really liked, but they were then snatched away by Reese Witherspoon, who hired them for a 3-film deal. So that was the end of that. But the truth is that my books are extremely interior,
right?
And they're not without plot. But I would say that probably the greatest, I imagine the greatest pleasure for most of my readers is just delving very deep into who my characters are and how they came to be that way. Their pasts, their losses, their heartbreaks, their, dreams and hopes. And, that doesn't translate so well on the screen. Even now, Vigil Harbor has perhaps a more plot. There's a gun, there's explosions, and a film agent was very excited and read it. And she's a very good one. She has represented a lot of literary names. She said, this book is really, it's still, she said, I couldn't put it down, but it's still really, really interior. So, yeah. So anybody interested?
I can imagine an adaptation, in the way that, especially a lot of modern television focuses on character interactions and character conflict, drawing out sort of over time, kind of, there's an episodic quality in part because of the way the characters introduce their themes. So, very interior, which is a strength, but it also takes place very much in a world, and there are these moving chess pieces that come around. So maybe
I do have to think very hard about plot, but plot is a result of the choices that my characters make when confronted with situations that they're in and relationships that they're in. And then as they make choices, well, as I make them make choices, they have to, dance together throughout the book. And, with 8 characters telling one story, moving, chronologically from one to the next. It really, in a way, felt like, kind of a square dance or something, a choreography. This book felt very like I had to be a really good choreographer.
Right. No, and you were a wonderful choreographer. That very much shows in the novel.
I'm a klutz of a dancer, though I love to dance, but
Well, not on the page. No. I think we are out of time, unbelievably. We've even gone a little over. So it was a real pleasure seeing you. I haven't seen you in a long time. So
Thank you so much, Daniel. I really appreciate this. It was a lot of fun. I've been looking forward to it. And everybody, thank you so much for coming and, buy all your books from Powell's and all other independent bookstores.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both so much. It was fantastic to hear you both talk about all that, and great conversation there. So please go and purchase a copy of Vigil Harbor.
And Daniel's books too.
And Daniel's books. This is, I think this is your latest book, Daniel, too, this one here, Registry. So check that out. I put, I don't know if you can see on there, it's Daniel's.
Yeah.
So definitely check those out and purchase. And while you're on pals.com, check out our upcoming events. We've got all kinds of cool people coming up virtually and live for those in town. So once again, thanks you both for joining us. Thanks everybody out there. And
Thank you, Daniel. Okay.
all right, have a good night, everyone.
You
Bye,
too.
everybody.